Good evening. You're listening to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian, and the candles have nearly burned down. Outside, the wind moves through the old stone alleys of Canterbury. Tonight, we drift back to the 12th century, to a single wild night that changed the laws of medieval England forever. It began, as many medieval tragedies did, with too much pride and too much wine. King Henry II was not a man to whisper when angry. One winter's night in 1170, surrounded by his barons, he muttered a question that would echo through centuries. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" His words were not meant as an order, at least, that's what he later claimed. But in a world where loyalty was absolute, and misunderstanding could cost a life, 4 knights took his frustration as command. They left the royal court, their armor clinking softly beneath wool cloaks, bound for Canterbury. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop, had once been Henry's closest friend, a man of charm, intellect, and wit. They had hunted together, feasted together, and plotted together. Henry had raised him high, hoping to control the church through a man he trusted. But power, once handed to the pious, does not always return willingly. Becket had become something Henry did not expect, defiant. He resisted royal interference in church courts, insisting that clerics accused of crimes could only be judged by God's law, not the king's. In an age when divine authority ruled men's souls, this was no small rebellion. And so, the stage was set for one of the most shocking acts in English history. The knights arrived at Canterbury Cathedral as dusk fell. The winter wind whistled through the cloisters, scattering straw and snow. Inside, Becket stood at the altar calm, as though expecting them. They shouted accusations, demanding he submit to royal justice. He refused. Swords flashed. Echoes of iron struck stone, and the sound of devotion met the sound of violence. When it was over, the holy place lay still. Becket's blood darkened the floor before the altar, and one of his killers, in horror, whispered that they had slain God's own servant. Outside, bells tolled without command. The kingdom would never be the same again. The night had been loud with anger and steel, but the morning that followed was quieter than any in living memory. Dawn crept across Canterbury in pale strokes of light, sliding over rooftops glazed with frost. The cathedral doors remained closed. Not even the crows dared to perch on its spires. Inside, the silence was broken only by the drip of melted snow through cracked glass. It fell upon the altar, upon the flagstones, upon the pool of blood that had congealed where Thomas Becket's body lay. The monks, pale and trembling, gathered around him in disbelief. One whispered prayers in Latin, the others cleaned the floor with linen and tears. They did not know whether to treat the place as a crime scene or a shrine. Words spread as fast as the winter wind. By mid-morning, peasants whispered in markets that the archbishop had been murdered by the king's own men. Merchants halted their carts in the streets. Nobles locked their doors. The very idea that a man of God could be slain in a holy place shook the realm like thunder. Henry II, far away in his palace, awoke to a chill deeper than the cold stone beneath his feet. Messengers arrived breathless, robes flecked with snow, delivering news that turned his blood to lead. Becket, his old friend, his rival, was dead. For a long moment, the king said nothing. He only stared at the floor, the air around him tightening with dread. Then he turned away, muttering words no one dared to record. Some said he tore his robe. Others said he struck his head against the wall, whispering, "What have I done?" In truth, no one would ever know the full measure of Henry's guilt, or his grief. He had not commanded the killing outright, yet his temper had lit the fuse. And in the 12th century, where a king's words were law, intent mattered less than consequence. In the days that followed, the 4 knights hid themselves in castles, each praying for forgiveness that would not come. Their names were whispered in disgust: Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, Richard Le Breton, noblemen reduced to fugitives. Meanwhile, pilgrims began to arrive at Canterbury, drawn by rumor and reverence. The monks washed Becket's body and dressed it in robes of gold. They laid him in the crypt beneath the cathedral. And there, before the candles and silence, something extraordinary began to happen. A blind woman claimed her sight returned after touching the stone where he had fallen. A feverish child was said to have been cured by a drop of his dried blood. A soldier swore his wounds closed when he prayed at the crypt. Miracles, or so the people said. In an age when faith was the thread that held society together, these tales spread faster than any royal decree. The people had lost a bishop, but gained a saint. By spring, the murder that had begun in secret had become the loudest story in Christendom. Pilgrims came from as far as Rome to kneel at the site. Merchants sold relics, fragments of cloth, drops of oil, even dust from the crypt. The church declared Becket a martyr. And in 1173, barely 3 years after his death, he was canonized by the Pope himself. Henry II was cornered by consequence. The king who had ruled with pride now found his authority broken by a man who was no longer alive. The church, emboldened by Becket's sainthood, demanded justice, not through battle, but through humiliation. And so, in July of that same year, King Henry, ruler of England, lord of Normandy, master of vast lands, knelt barefoot in the mud before Canterbury Cathedral. He wore a plain wool shirt, no crown, no sword. As the monks of Becket's order looked on, he confessed his sin. Each monk, in turn, struck him across the back with a rod, not out of cruelty, but penance. Blood for blood. Forgiveness for authority. When it was done, the king rose, his power cleansed but forever changed. For from that day, a new law began to take shape, one that separated the sacred from the secular, one that whispered of limits even for kings. The murder of Becket, unplanned yet inevitable, had rewritten the moral order of England. And across Europe, monarchs would take note. The ripples from Canterbury spread far beyond England's shores. Across Europe, priests, scholars, and kings whispered of the strange new order born from blood, a martyr's death forcing a monarch to his knees. What had once been a quarrel between friends had become a question of civilization itself. Who holds authority, God or man? Before Becket's murder, the boundaries were blurred. A king could command nearly anything within his realm, and a bishop could claim divine immunity when convenient. Justice was an uncertain art, half sword, half scripture. When a cleric committed a crime, kings wanted punishment, the church wanted penance. Now, after Becket's death, those lines could no longer remain in shadow. In England, Henry II began to draft what historians later called the Compromise of Avranches. It was less a treaty than a confession written into law. The king swore to abandon his claim over the punishment of the clergy. No more royal interference in church courts. He restored lands taken from the church, vowed to support its privileges, and promised peace with Rome. In other words, the law of the land bent to the law of the cross. For a while, the balance seemed to work. Kings could rule their subjects, but they dared not touch the sacred. Bishops could bless their flocks, but they would not openly defy their monarch. Between the two hung an uneasy truce, one that would shape Europe's legal foundation for centuries to come. But in the quiet corners of monasteries and royal chambers, thinkers began to ponder something new. If the king himself could be humbled by a murdered priest, then was justice truly divine? Or could it be written, codified, reasoned by human minds? The 12th century was an age of parchment and ink, of men who believed that the world could be explained if one only wrote enough Latin. Law schools sprouted in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Scholars studied old Roman scrolls, reinterpreting them for their own fractured world. They began to imagine law as a living thing, something not granted by God alone, but shaped by custom, memory, and the consequences of history. Becket's death had shown them that unchecked power, even sanctified, could corrupt both throne and altar. It forced minds to imagine limits. And so, slowly, the medieval idea of justice began to evolve. Trial by ordeal, the plunging of hands into boiling water or the carrying of red-hot iron, started to lose favor, at least among the educated. The notion of written law gained strength. Kings still ruled, but they began to consult councils, record verdicts, and rely on precedent. Becket's ghost lingered over every court, a silent reminder that justice without conscience was nothing more than vengeance in robes. For the ordinary peasant, of course, the change was not immediately visible. The village reeve still barked orders. The bailiff still collected rents. The sheriff still came knocking with iron keys. But beneath these daily routines, something deeper had shifted, the first stirrings of what would one day become common law. A law not for the king alone, nor the priest, but for everyone under heaven. It was fragile, uncertain, and centuries away from the parchment of the Magna Carta, yet the seed had been sown. And in that seed was the idea that rulers must answer to something higher than themselves, be it God, reason, or the cry of conscience echoing from a cathedral floor. When pilgrims came to Canterbury, they no longer came only for miracles. They came to stand in the place where justice had learned humility. They came to feel the chill of that stone and remember the day when the law first trembled, and grew wiser for it. Outside, the wind moved through the cloisters again, whispering through centuries, as if carrying the faint sound of Becket's voice. The king's will is strong, but the law of heaven endures. The echoes of Canterbury rolled like thunder across the continent. Kings in France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire all felt the tremor of that one wild night. It wasn't merely the murder of an archbishop that unsettled them, it was what it revealed. That even the most powerful ruler in Christendom could be made to kneel before the altar of conscience. Europe in the 12th century was not a single kingdom but a tapestry of loyalties, languages, and faiths, each thread woven by blood and belief. Yet all were united by one invisible thread, the authority of the Church. The Pope's seal could legitimize or destroy a crown. Becket's death gave that authority a story, a parable written not in scripture but in spilled blood. In the French court of Louis VII, Becket's canonization was greeted with solemn triumph. France, long at odds with Henry II, seized the moment to praise the sanctity of God's martyr. It was a political blessing disguised as piety. French bishops invoked Becket's name whenever royal officials pressed too hard into church matters. If England's king could be shamed, they whispered, so could any. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, red-bearded, iron-willed, read the papal letters with mixed feelings. He had fought his own bitter wars with the Pope, insisting that emperors were chosen by divine right, not ecclesiastical favor. Yet even he could not ignore the symbolism of Canterbury. Barbarossa's advisers warned, "The people now see holiness as a shield against crowns." And in that, the Church found a new weapon, moral outrage. Across monasteries and lecture halls, Becket's story became a lesson in the limits of kings. Students at the University of Paris debated it endlessly. Was Becket a rebel or a saint? Could a priest defy a monarch without sin? Theologians scribbled their answers in cramped Latin, but one theme kept returning: the law of man must serve the law of God, or both will perish. But laws, like water, flow where the ground permits. In Italy, the papal court saw opportunity. By promoting Becket's sainthood, the Church strengthened its influence over temporal rulers. Popes began issuing clearer decrees defining the rights of clergy, marriage, inheritance, and even war. This evolving canon law became a vast web, binding kings with rules that reached into their very households. And in time, many monarchs realized they were caught within it. Yet, for all its sanctity, even the church could not hold absolute sway. As the years passed, rulers learned a subtler art. They began to legalize their power. They no longer defied Rome outright. They built bureaucracies, recorded taxes, and established courts loyal to the crown. They wrote their own laws, in parchment, not anger, to prove that kings could wield justice as well as faith. In this slow dance between mitre and crown, Becket's ghost lingered, neither triumphant nor defeated. His martyrdom had not ended the struggle, it had refined it. Justice became less about divine wrath and more about negotiation, precedent, and written reason. A strange new idea began to stir among jurists and chroniclers. Perhaps the law should protect the weak from the strong, not merely the ruler from rebellion. It would take centuries for that notion to mature. But it began here, in the uneasy peace that followed a murder. Pilgrims still streamed to Canterbury, their footsteps wearing grooves into the stone. They carried with them wax images of Becket, stories of his miracles, and the quiet conviction that justice, once awakened, could never truly sleep again. They prayed not just for mercy, but for fairness, a dangerous and revolutionary wish in a feudal world. And so, from the cold cathedral in Kent to the courts of Paris, from the monasteries of Cologne to the scriptoria of Rome, the question spread like a whisper in candlelight. If even kings can err, who then shall guard the law? The answer would come, centuries later, in the form of charters, councils, and revolutions. But in that moment, it lived only as a flicker of thought, a small, sacred rebellion in the minds of men. The decades after Becket's death were outwardly peaceful, or at least as peaceful as a medieval kingdom could be. But beneath that calm, something ancient and restless stirred. It moved not in the cathedrals or royal halls this time, but in the hearts of those who tilled the soil, guarded the gates, and carried swords for others' causes. The people of England had seen their king kneel in the mud before the church. They had seen him humbled not by battle, but by belief. And in that image, a ruler bareheaded, beaten by monks in repentance, a seed was planted. A quiet question took root in the English soul. If a king can be punished for his sins, then who decides what justice truly is? No one dared ask that question aloud. Yet it hummed beneath every oath of fealty, every royal decree, every grain tax collected under watchful eyes. The barons, those armored middlemen between crown and commoner, were the first to give that question shape. They had fought for their lands, inherited titles older than memory, and now they watched kings grow richer and greedier under the banner of divine right. Henry II was gone, his penitent pilgrimage buried under years of political triumph. His sons, however, were made of fire and hunger. Richard the Lionheart, all steel and crusades, barely ruled England at all, preferring the heat of the Holy Land to the cold discipline of governance. But his brother John was another story entirely. King John Plantagenet inherited a kingdom restless with unfinished business. He was clever, calculating, and cursed with the misfortune of following better men. He taxed the church, extorted the barons, and squeezed his peasants until the very air of England smelled of resentment. And though he never mentioned Thomas Becket's name, his reign was haunted by the same old ghost, the warning that no ruler could escape judgment forever. The chroniclers of the age described the land as heavy with discontent. Priests muttered of famine as divine punishment. Merchants whispered of tyranny in their ledgers. Even the nobles, who once dined beside kings, began to imagine a world where law could stand above the crown, not merely beside it. It was a dangerous dream, and it began in the quiet corners of abbeys and manor houses. In the year 1215, the dream finally broke into daylight. A group of rebel barons confronted King John at a place called Runnymede, beside the slow waters of the Thames. There, beneath an open sky, surrounded by tense intention, they forced the king to sign a parchment that would forever alter the shape of law, the Magna Carta. Its words were simple, almost rustic. But they carried the weight of centuries, the echo of Becket's defiance, the memory of a king's repentance, the murmur of peasants who had begun to believe that fairness was not a sin. For the first time, the law was written not as command, but as boundary. It said the king must obey his own justice, that he could not imprison or dispossess a man without lawful reason, that taxes must be agreed upon, not demanded by decree. It was not equality. It was not democracy. But it was a beginning. The quills scratched, the wax seals cooled, and in the hush that followed, one could almost hear the distant bells of Canterbury, a ghostly chime marking the slow birth of accountability. Becket had died defending the law of God, but his shadow had outlived the argument. His sacrifice had turned into something broader, a belief that justice must not depend on favor, or fear, or the whim of power. When King John placed his reluctant seal upon the Magna Carta, the ink might as well have been mixed with Becket's blood. The document would be torn up, rewritten, and ignored many times in the centuries to come, but its spirit was alive, and it would not die. Because now, for the first time, England had a memory. A memory of what happens when kings forget their limits. A memory of a night in Canterbury where power met conscience, and conscience endured. The laws of kings were written on parchment, sealed with wax, and kept in chests guarded by men who could read. But for most of medieval England, justice was not something found in castles or charters. It lived instead in the open air, in the cold mornings of village squares, beneath the creak of a church bell or the rustle of an elm tree. In these small, self-contained worlds, law took on a more human shape. There were no lawyers here, no Latin decrees, no polished judges in scarlet robes. Instead, there were reeves, bailiffs, and elders, men chosen from among their neighbors to keep order as best they could. And though they would never have said his name aloud, the spirit of Becket's defiance, the idea that justice should not be arbitrary, lingered even here. Every village had its meeting place. Sometimes it was a field marked by a standing stone. Sometimes it was a hall with smoke-stained beams. And sometimes it was nothing more than the churchyard itself, where roosters scratched the earth beside the graves. Here disputes were settled, fines were declared, and oaths were sworn, all under the watching eyes of God and gossip alike. A man who stole grain might be fined 3 pence. A woman accused of slander could be ordered to stand before the parish and apologize. If a crime was serious, theft, assault, or worse, the village would send word to the royal justices when they next rode through. These traveling judges, appointed by the king, brought with them a new kind of order, written record, consistent punishment, and precedent. It was a strange arrangement, this mix of royal authority and local conscience. But it worked. Because for all their superstition and simplicity, medieval villagers understood something timeless, that law had to feel fair. Too harsh, and people rebelled. Too lenient, and chaos crept in. Justice, like bread, had to be made fresh each day. In time, these small courts became part of a grander web, a network of custom and memory. One verdict would be compared to another. One village's rule would echo in the next. And out of these repetitions, the slow rhythm of consistency, something profound began to form: common law. It was not born in Westminster's marble halls, but here, among the chickens and children, where people knew each other's names. When a neighbor swore on the Bible, his trembling hand carried centuries of tradition. When a reeve pronounced a fine, it wasn't just punishment, it was a promise that tomorrow would not be lawless. Yet for all its growing order, medieval life still carried the weight of belief. A man might appeal to justice, but he still feared judgment. God's law and the king's law were twins, never quite alike, never quite apart. When a verdict felt unjust, people sometimes turned to holy places for mercy. They sought sanctuary. Inside a church, even the worst sinner could claim safety, at least for a while. It was a rule older than any royal charter, written in the bones of Christendom itself. A murderer might clasp the altar and live, untouchable, while priests decided his fate. To drag him out was to risk excommunication, to defy God's peace. Some abused it, of course. There were tales of thieves sprinting through village streets, pursuers at their heels, bursting through church doors and clinging to the crucifix with panting desperation. But even then, the people respected the ritual. Justice must wait until mercy had its say. And so, day by day, England's legal soul matured. It learned from kings, from clerics, from mistakes and miracles alike. It became a living dialogue between punishment and forgiveness, power and conscience. When villagers gathered in the square, they no longer saw law as something distant and cruel. It was something they participated in, flawed, sometimes unfair, but theirs. And that, in its own humble way, was Beckett's true legacy, that justice must not only be done by the powerful, but understood by the powerless. Before juries and written verdicts, before men debated evidence and precedent, there was only one true judge in medieval Europe, God Himself. When human wisdom failed, when witnesses disagreed, or when no one could say what was right, people turned to ordeals, rituals designed to let the divine reveal the truth. To modern minds, they sound like madness. To medieval ones, they were faith in action. A woman accused of theft might be ordered to plunge her hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. A man charged with lying might carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces. After 3 days, the priest would unwrap the bandages. If the wound had begun to heal, God had judged them innocent. If it festered, guilt was certain. There were also ordeals by water, often used on the poor or the powerless. The accused would be tied and thrown into a pond or river, sometimes with a cross hanging from their neck. If they sank, the water, seen as pure, had accepted them, and they were innocent. If they floated, the water rejected their sin, and they were guilty. It sounds cruel. But to those who lived it, it was not torture. It was a conversation with heaven. They believed that the Almighty saw all things, that even the smallest injustice would be corrected under His gaze. Priests presided over these rituals with solemn precision. They fasted before the ordeal, sprinkled holy water on the instruments, and prayed aloud for truth to be shown. Every gesture, every word was meant to draw the sacred into the earthly. And when the accused stood trembling before the crowd, they were not merely being tested, they were being judged by the world beyond. Some historians say these ordeals were less about physical proof than psychological pressure. Few would dare to undergo such trials unless they were truly certain of their innocence, or had powerful faith. And the priests, who often controlled how the ordeal was carried out, could quietly influence the outcome. A slightly cooler iron, a prayer said longer, a blessing whispered over the water, all could tilt divine favor. But that illusion of God's direct hand gave these trials their power. For a world without cameras or records, where truth was slippery and rumor deadly, the ordeal was certainty. If you survived, heaven itself had spoken. Then came a turning point, quiet but revolutionary. In 1215, the Church, under Pope Innocent III, forbade clergy from taking part in ordeals. They were no longer to bless the iron or sanctify the water. Without the Church's hand, the ritual lost its holiness, and thus, its authority. Across Europe, kings and judges were forced to find new ways to discover guilt. And so began the slow, uneasy birth of trial by jury. 12 men, often neighbors of the accused, were chosen to speak truth not by divine miracle, but by human conscience. It was imperfect, as all human things are. Prejudice, rumor, and fear crept easily into their verdicts. But something profound had shifted. Justice was no longer in the hands of God alone. It now belonged, tentatively, awkwardly, to the people. For the first time, the balance began to tip away from miracle and toward reason. The cauldrons cooled. The iron was set aside. And the human voice, hesitant, fallible, but free, began to take its place in the long conversation of law. In the smoky halls of village courts, you could almost hear the echo of change. The whisper that maybe truth was not found in boiling water or holy flame, but in the simple courage of men willing to listen to one another. By the early 13th century, England had grown tired of being ruled like a personal farm by a king who saw himself as above all law. King John, the same monarch who quarreled with the Church, lost Normandy to the French, and taxed his nobles until their purses wept, had pushed the realm too far. The barons, weary of his greed and his temper, gathered their strength. They were not revolutionaries. They were men of land and title, bound by oaths and centuries of tradition. But when a king forgets his duty, even loyalty has its limits. In the spring of 1215, on the wide green meadows of Runnymede, a few miles from London, the king was cornered. Surrounded by banners and armored men, he sat beneath a makeshift tent and listened as his own subjects dictated terms. The wind was thick with silence, not the respectful kind, but the tense, waiting kind that belongs to history. The document they pressed upon him would later be known as the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its words were written in Latin, inked by clerks whose hands surely trembled as they realized what they were committing to parchment. For the first time, a ruler of England would be told, in writing, that even he was not above the law. Among its many clauses, one stood out like a lantern in fog. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. A simple sentence. But within it lived a revolution. No longer could a man be dragged to a dungeon on the king's whim. No longer could justice depend entirely on royal favor or fury. Now it was bound, like a beast tamed by ink, to a set of principles that could not easily be broken. At first, of course, John had no intention of keeping it. He signed under duress, muttering to himself, already planning revenge. Within months he appealed to the Pope, who conveniently annulled the charter as invalid. War followed. John died of dysentery soon after, a small, smelly end to a large and noisy life. Yet the Magna Carta lived on. It was reissued, reinterpreted, and rewritten over the centuries, each time a little stronger, a little clearer. The barons had not meant to invent democracy. They simply wanted their rights. But ideas, once written, have a way of escaping their authors. That line, by the lawful judgment of his equals, echoed through generations. It became the seed of trial by jury, due process, and habeas corpus, the right to not vanish into a prison cell without cause. Even today, every time a judge declares that no man is above the law, they are whispering an echo of Runnymede, where a reluctant king signed away the illusion of divine authority, and replaced it, unknowingly, with the rule of law. Imagine being there that day. The air smells of parchment and damp grass. The king's wax seal presses down with a soft, resigned squelch. And though no trumpet sounds, no angel descends, the world quietly shifts. From tyranny toward accountability. From one toward written word. It was not freedom, not yet. But it was the first breath of it. And as Europe watched England's strange experiment unfold, other rulers began to sense the danger. For if a king could be forced to obey a charter, then who truly ruled, the crown or the paper? That question would haunt thrones for centuries. The Magna Carta had done something subtle but irreversible. It taught the world that power could be written down. And once that happened, scribes became as mighty as swordsmen. Across medieval Europe, the soft scratching of quills replaced the clashing of steel as the sound of authority. Royal clerks bent over parchment in candlelit chambers, recording charters, decrees, and judgments. Ink flowed through the veins of government, and from that ink rose a new creature, the bureaucrat. It began innocently enough. Every king needed records of taxes paid, fines collected, land disputes settled. A chest of scrolls might contain the wealth of a kingdom. In England, the great pipe rolls listed every payment owed to the crown, neat as beads on a rosary. In France, royal clerks maintained the registers of Parliament, where even the smallest village case might someday find its echo. The age of memory was giving way to the age of record. But paperwork had a strange magic of its own. It made law seem objective, permanent, something that existed even when the judge slept and the king rode off to war. For the first time, ordinary people could point to a written decree and say, "Here is what was promised." A parchment was fragile, yes, it could tear, smudge, or burn. But the idea of the parchment was indestructible. The scribe became a quiet sort of priest, translating human chaos into the language of order. He dipped his quill, whispered a prayer that the ink not blot, and drew letters as carefully as if carving commandments in stone. Each curl of script was an act of faith, not in God this time, but in the written word itself. And because laws were now written, they could also be read, argued, and most dangerously, questioned. "What does this phrase mean?" a merchant might ask. "Does this clause apply to me?" a peasant might wonder. With ink came interpretation, and with interpretation came debate, the first murmur of modern legal thinking. University scholars began studying Roman law, rediscovered from ancient manuscripts. In Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, students copied texts of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, tracing the margins with their own notes, their own thoughts. They debated principles like equity, justice, and due process not as divine mysteries, but as systems that could be understood, and perhaps improved. Thus, the lawyer was born, not yet in wig and robe, but in ink-stained fingers and sleepless nights beneath flickering candles. The medieval bureaucrat and the scholar together built a bridge between faith and logic. They turned divine will into legal reasoning, and personal vengeance into administrative formality. It was slow, imperfect, and often dull, but it worked. Because for every tyrant who tried to bend the rules, there was now a clerk who could unroll a scroll and calmly say, "Your Grace, according to the record." And so, quietly, paper began to hold power over flesh. A sealed charter could outlive its signer. A recorded judgment could outlast its judge. Kings died. Empires fell. But the archives remained. Rows of leather-bound scrolls breathing dust and eternity. In those vaults, you could trace the slow heartbeat of civilization. Each document was a pulse, each signature a small defiance of chaos. Law, once a living breath between priest and peasant, had become a written skeleton. Sturdy, dry, and enduring. And as Europe's shelves filled with parchment, a new truth emerged. What was written began to matter more than who spoke. By the 13th century, the law no longer belonged solely to kings or barons. It had found another master, a quieter one, but no less powerful. The Church. Its courts stretched across Europe like a web of parchment and incense. From the smallest parish to the marble halls of Rome, the Church governed not just souls, but marriages, wills, oaths, and even whispered sins. To be medieval was to live under two laws. One for the body, ruled by the king, and one for the soul, ruled by the Church. In monasteries, where the smell of ink and beeswax filled the air, canon lawyers pored over volumes of decrees and papal letters. The Decretum Gratiani became their compass, a vast compilation of church rules woven together by a monk named Gratian around the year 1140. He had not meant to start a legal revolution, only to bring order to centuries of confusion. But his work became the foundation of canon law, the law of God's house. If a man swore falsely, he might find himself summoned to the bishop's court. If a woman sought to dissolve a marriage, she came not before a royal judge, but before a priest trained in both scripture and procedure. The Church claimed jurisdiction wherever morality was involved, and in the Middle Ages, morality was everywhere. Confession, too, was a kind of trial. Behind the wooden lattice, the penitents spoke their sins. The priest listened, weighed, and sentenced, not with prison or coin, but with penance. A pilgrimage to Canterbury, perhaps. A week of fasting. A vow of silence. In this way, the Church taught people to see justice not as punishment, but as purification. And yet, the Church's courts were not merely spiritual. They held real power, the power to excommunicate, to damn reputations, to strip titles. A king who angered the Pope could find himself abandoned by his own people, his kingdom declared under interdict, where no bells rang and no sacraments were given. Even rulers trembled at the sound of papal ink scratching against parchment. A single letter sealed with the fisherman's ring could bring an empire to its knees. But the Church's dominance came with its own complications. Its law was divine, yet it was administered by men, and men, as always, are fond of loopholes. Bribes whispered through monastery corridors. Bishops ruled like barons, their courts serving coin as much as conscience. And soon, the faithful began to murmur, if the Church judges souls, who judges the Church? Still, the Church had one advantage that no secular authority could match: literacy. Its scribes wrote, copied, and preserved. They were the keepers of memory, and therefore of power. When a dispute arose over land, marriage, or inheritance, the bishop's court often had the only written records. Kings came and went, wars burned villages to ash, but in some monastery scriptorium, the truth remained, carefully illuminated in red and gold. These courts of God gave Europe something more enduring than fear, structure. They taught people to argue with logic, to appeal with words rather than weapons. They trained minds to think of justice as something that could be reasoned, not just suffered. So even when kings resented the Church's reach, they quietly borrowed its methods. The royal courts began keeping better records. Judges started citing precedent. And slowly, the two systems, divine and earthly, began to resemble each other. It was, in its own way, a strange kind of harmony. A world where a sin could be punished with fasting, a theft with a fine, and both with the hope of forgiveness. Justice, it seemed, had learned to kneel, but not yet to stand. By the late 13th century, the kings of Europe had grown tired of bowing to the Church. They had watched their priests hold courts, their bishops gather wealth, and their popes command armies of parchment and prayer. And quietly, beneath the incense and candles, resentment had been simmering. The idea that a king could not punish his own subjects without clerical permission, it gnawed at royal pride. So, one by one, the crowns of Europe began to reclaim the scales of justice. England led the way. After the chaos of civil war and rebellion, King Edward I, sharp-minded, iron-willed, decided that law must flow from the throne once more. He sent royal judges across the land, riding dusty roads from castle to shire, to hold court in the king's name. Wherever they went, they carried with them not swords, but scrolls. Records of decisions, lists of offenses, and the king's own writs sealed in wax. These men were called itinerant justices, and they were the seeds of something astonishing. The idea that justice could be consistent, no matter where one lived. From the cliffs of Dover to the hills of York, the same principles began to take root. And thus was born the great English experiment, common law. No longer would every village invent its own punishments. The judgments made by royal courts became examples, precedents, that future judges would follow. One case at a time, they stitched a patchwork of rulings into a single fabric that could cover the realm. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French crown was doing something similar, but grander. Under Philip IV, the Iron King, the monarchy began to challenge papal authority directly. He taxed the clergy, defied the Pope, and eventually moved the papacy itself to Avignon. A quiet coup accomplished not with soldiers, but with law. The king's clerks, trained in canon law, ironically enough, became his weapons. They wrote decrees, built archives, and argued with precision that would have impressed any theologian. And so, even as kings fought the church, they learned from it. The robe replaced the sword, the seal replaced the scepter. In both realms, something ancient was shifting. Justice was becoming statecraft. Royal judges now wore robes of scarlet or sable, their symbols embroidered with lions or lilies. They spoke with the calm authority of men who carry not divine will, but royal command. When they arrived in town, peasants gathered to watch. To them, the judge was almost mystical, part messenger, part magician, bringing order where chaos had reigned. And yet, beneath the ceremony, the work was methodical. Clerks copied down pleas. Sheriffs gathered juries. Bailiffs executed writs. The king's law was no longer an abstract ideal. It was a living network of men, ink, and duty. But power, as always, breeds its own dangers. The church had once judged too freely in the name of God. Now kings did the same in the name of order. A peasant might still lose his land for lack of coin to bribe a local official. A merchant might find his case delayed for months, waiting for a judge too busy with noble quarrels. Even the king's justice could be bought, twisted, or simply lost in paperwork. Still, for all its flaws, there was something revolutionary about it. Law had become a craft, one that could be studied, refined, improved. And even if the poor could not always afford it, they now knew it existed. Somewhere, in theory at least, there was a higher court where their voice might be heard. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless. And as the royal courts grew stronger, so too did the idea that justice was not only a duty of kings but a right of men. That idea, once whispered in the meadows of Runnymede, was taking shape in parchment and precedent. But there was still one more test to come. A storm that would shake both throne and church, and force Europe to decide. When faith and crown collide, whose law survives? As the Middle Ages deepened, the greatest enemy of kings and priests alike was not a rival army, nor plague, nor famine. It was ideas. By the 14th century, whispers had begun to circulate through Europe's cloisters and taverns. Whispers of doubt, of scripture questioned, of authority challenged. Men and women began to ask, what if the church was wrong? What if God's law was not the same as man's law? To the rulers of the age, such thoughts were more dangerous than swords. They struck at the very roots of order, at the fragile illusion that the world made sense because heaven said so. Thus, a new form of justice was born, the Inquisition. It did not wear the face of kings or bishops, but of inquisitors, black-robed men who served neither crown nor country, but the faith itself. They traveled in pairs or small groups, carrying crosses, parchments, and an unshakable conviction that error was a contagion to be cured. Wherever they went, they set up tribunals. Accusations were collected, often anonymously. Witnesses were summoned, not to defend but to confess. And in candlelit chambers lined with icons, the accused would kneel before the table of inquiry. "Do you deny the teachings of the Church?" they were asked. "Do you persist in your error?" The language was soft, almost polite, but beneath it ran the steel of inevitability. To question too boldly was to end up in chains. And yet, this was not lawless cruelty. The inquisitors saw themselves as healers of souls. They used procedure, written testimony, examination, even appeals. They kept meticulous records, often in Latin so fine it bordered on art. In a grim, meticulous way, they were jurists of the spirit. But the line between faith and fear was thin. Torture, once forbidden by both canon and royal law, crept into the process like smoke through a crack. The rack, the pulley, the boots, each justified as a tool for saving the soul through confession. Still, the Church insisted it was mercy. A heretic who repented could be absolved. Only the obstinate, those who refused to bend, were handed to the secular arm, to be burned as an act of purification. And the crowds came to watch. Not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. In their eyes, heresy was not opinion, it was poison. To see it destroyed was reassurance that the world, fragile as it was, remained intact. Yet quietly, doubt kept smoldering. In the words of thinkers like William of Ockham, who argued that reason had a place beside faith. In the defiance of John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English so common folk could read it. In the courage of Jan Hus, who preached that no man should obey a corrupt priest. They were condemned, yes, some to exile, others to flame. But their trials did something unexpected. They forced Europe to confront its conscience. For the first time, people began to see the machinery of religious law, its procedures, its oaths, its punishments, and to wonder whether justice could truly live in fear's shadow. The inquisitors thought they were defending truth. In a way they were. But they also revealed that the law, divine or earthly, is always at its most fragile when it forgets compassion. And when those fires finally dimmed, Europe was left staring into the ashes, asking not whether the heretics had been wrong, but whether the judges had ever been right. The centuries that followed would bring answers, painful, slow, and revolutionary ones. For even as faith's tribunals burned in the name of purity, a quiet rebellion was rising in the hearts of men who had watched too long. Men who believed justice could be found not in torture or terror, but in the courage to question. For centuries, the law had belonged to kings, to bishops, to men who owned more parchment than fields. The peasantry, bound to the land, had obeyed because obedience was survival. But as the 14th century wore on, after plague, after taxes, after endless wars, something in the air began to crack. It began, as most revolutions do, not with speeches or banners, but with exhaustion. Across Europe, the Black Death had swept through towns and villages, leaving behind silence and strange opportunity. So many dead, and so few hands left to till the soil. For the first time, the laborer's work had value. But when peasants asked for higher wages, for fairer treatment, for freedom from serfdom's chains, the lords replied with new laws, laws meant to freeze time itself. In England, it came as the Statute of Labourers, 1351, decreeing that no man should demand more pay than before the plague. In France, similar decrees followed, binding workers to their manners as though the pestilence had never passed. The people obeyed, for a while. But hunger and injustice ferment faster than ale. And in 1381, that slow simmer boiled over into the peasants' revolt. It began in the fields of Kent and Essex, where tax collectors had gone too far, prying into cottages, demanding payment for sons barely old enough to hold a spade. Within days, thousands were marching toward London, led by a man named Wat Tyler. Their banners bore not coats of arms, but simple prayers for fairness. No lord, no serf, they said, but all free under God. They moved like a tide of desperation and hope, unarmed save for pitchforks, clubs, and a belief that justice, at last, might listen. When they reached the capital, the gates were opened, whether out of fear or sympathy, no one knows. Inside, they found the symbols of their oppression: tax records, legal documents, the archives of debt. They burned them all. For a brief, smoke-filled moment, the law itself went up in flames. Young King Richard II, barely 14, rode out to meet them at Mile End. He promised reforms, freedom for serfs, fair wages, forgiveness. But when their leader, Tyler, later approached for negotiation at Smithfield, the mayor of London struck him down without warning. The boy king calmed the crowd with soothing words, promising mercy once again. Then, when the rebels dispersed and the fields fell silent, vengeance began. Hundreds were executed. The promises vanished. The old laws crept back into place, like weeds after a storm. And yet something had changed. The revolt failed, but the memory of it did not. For the first time, peasants had spoken the language of rights. They had demanded not divine favor, but earthly justice. And though their petitions were torn, their ashes buried, their voices lingered in every village that whispered, "We are men, not beasts." Even the lords learned a lesson, not one of compassion, but of caution. They saw that too much pressure, too much cruelty, could break even the most obedient subjects. Slowly, labor laws softened. Serfdom began to fade, not because of kindness, but because of necessity. The revolts spread across Europe, Flanders, France, the German states, each one echoing the same cry for fairness. And while they all failed in the moment, they succeeded in something subtler. They made justice itself a public conversation. No longer could kings and nobles pretend that law was only their concern. From this century onward, every decree, every tax, every punishment carried an unspoken question. Is this just? The question was new. The courage to ask it was even newer. And those centuries would pass before those voices were truly heard. It was here, in muddy fields and burning manors, that the idea of the people and the law first began to take root. When the fields quieted after revolt, life began again, not in the castles or the courts, but in the hum of the cities. The stone streets of medieval towns became the new heart of law, where merchants, craftsmen, and dreamers wrote their own quiet codes of survival. If the countryside was ruled by kings, the city was ruled by custom, and by guilds. Each craft, from the weavers to the bakers, from the butchers to the candlemakers, had its own charter, its own oaths, and its own unwritten rules. To join was not merely to work, it was to belong, to be part of a brotherhood that guarded both trade and honor. And honor, in these cities, mattered as much as gold. Disputes were not always settled by swords or prisons, but by arbitration within the guild halls, smoky, timbered chambers heavy with the scent of wax and ink. If a man cheated a customer, his punishment might be a fine or the loss of his place in the guild, a social death as severe as any gallows. The guilds were lawmakers in miniature. They wrote ordinances on weights and measures, on how many loaves a baker could sell, on the purity of dyes, the honesty of silver. Their rules protected not just profits, but the fragile trust that bound the city together. For in these crowded streets, one dishonest hand could poison the market for all. The city's official laws, meanwhile, were etched in a different tone. Medieval towns had courts of their own, borough courts, merchant courts, and hustings, where disputes over trade, property, or insult were heard. Unlike the royal courts of marble and menace, these civic tribunals were often held in public squares, the proceedings watched by neighbors and rivals alike. Justice, here, was part performance, part negotiation. The merchant's law, lex mercatoria, even crossed borders. It was a kind of early international code, built not by kings but by commerce itself. A Florentine merchant could trade in Bruges or London knowing that his contract would be honored, that a ship lost to negligence or fraud would be compensated under shared rules. It was the law of handshakes, wax seals, and reputations, fragile but powerful. And while kings still held the right to judge, they increasingly relied on these merchant customs to keep the economy running. For when gold flowed, even monarchs learned to bend a little. Inside the city walls, one could almost forget the feudal world outside. Here, a poor apprentice could rise to master. A widow could run her own shop. A foreign trader might earn respect, even influence, through fairness and wit. It was, in its way, a small republic of reason, though hemmed in by superstition, corruption, and class. The clang of hammers, the scent of bread, the cries of hawkers, all were echoes of a new kind of order, one born not from divine right, but from mutual need. And yet the cities had their darker laws too. Beneath the bells and banners were the watchmen, the jails, and the public punishments meant to keep citizens in line. A thief caught in the market might be locked in the stocks, his humiliation a spectacle for laughter and lesson both. Women accused of gossip or slander were forced to wear scolds' bridles. Drunkards and cheats were marched through the streets with signs of their shame. It was a justice both familiar and strange, public, moral, and deeply theatrical. Punishment was not simply to correct but to remind that order was fragile, that sin was contagious, and that obedience was safer than defiance. Still, in the hum of the market and the murmur of the Guildhall, a new world was forming, one built on commerce, on compromise, on conversation rather than command. It was the first faint sound of something centuries ahead, the idea of civil society. And as candles burned late over parchment and ledgers, the old feudal laws began to fade like ghosts in morning light. The law, at last, had found a home among the people, and their work, their trust, their bargains whispered over ale. But not all corners of Europe were so fortunate. Beyond the walls, in forests and forgotten valleys, the old ways still ruled, the laws of superstition, of omen, and of unseen judgment. And that is where our story drifts next, into the shadows where reason and fear walked hand in hand. If you step out of the city gates, the cobblestones soon give way to soil, and with it, reason fades into something older. The countryside of medieval Europe was not ruled by statutes alone, but by whispers. And those whispers had power. In the twilight between faith and fear, a strange kind of justice thrived, the justice of superstition. Here, the law was not only written in books, but in the flight of ravens, the shape of clouds, or the milk that curdled in the pail. And for every crime that could be measured in theft or blood, there were others measured in curses, misfortunes, and unseen harm. When a cow fell sick, it was not the apothecary who was blamed first, but the neighbor who had once given a strange look. When a storm ruined the harvest, someone must have angered God. And when a child wasted away with no clear cause, the village spoke of spells, of hexes, of the evil eye. These fears did not remain in the fields. They crept into the courts. Across Europe, trials for witchcraft, sorcery, and heresy became a dark reflection of the age's faith. The Church, terrified of sin hiding in plain sight, created entire systems of law to combat the invisible. The Inquisition, first meant to root out heresy, soon found itself judging dreams and nightmares alike. In many places, the ordeal was still used, a trial by pain, where guilt or innocence was left to divine judgment. The accused might be made to hold red-hot iron or plunge a hand into boiling water. If the burn healed cleanly, they were innocent; if it festered, guilty. It was said to be justice guided by God's hand. But in truth, it was the trembling attempt of a frightened world to find order in chaos. Sometimes the tests were gentler, though no less cruel. A suspected witch might be thrown into a river, not to drown, but to float. Floating, it was said, proved guilt; the pure element of water rejected the impure. Sinking, paradoxically, proved innocence, though few were pulled out in time to enjoy it. The courts did not invent these fears, they simply gave them paperwork. In parchment and wax, superstition gained legitimacy. A rumor became an accusation. An accusation became a record. And a record became precedent, the cold heartbeat of law itself. But not all judges believed in this witchcraft of justice. Some, particularly in the cities, began to doubt. They saw the cruelty in condemning widows, the absurdity of trying the wind for blowing too fiercely. One French magistrate, Michel de Montaigne, would later write that truth and falsehood have both the same countenance when fear is in the room. And though he lived centuries after the peak of witch trials, his words could have silenced many gallows had they come sooner. In time, scholars and theologians began to push back. They argued that witchcraft was heresy of imagination, not evidence, but fear turned inward. That the devil, if he existed, did not lurk in old women's gardens or the cauldrons of herbalists. Yet for every skeptic, 10 more priests saw shadows. And so, the superstition laws endured. They spread, mutating with each region, maleficium in Italy, hexerai in Germany, sortilegio in Spain. Each term different, each punishment the same. The witch hunts would not reach their true fever until the Renaissance and Reformation. But their roots lay here, in the medieval courtroom where faith and law blurred together. It was not justice that these trials served, but the ancient need to explain what could not be understood. Still, not all magic was condemned. The same monks who denounced witches still blessed relics, read the stars, and whispered charms in Latin. Kings themselves relied on astrologers to plan battles and marriages. A contradiction, yes, but then, the Middle Ages were built on contradiction. By torchlight and superstition, Europe judged itself, and in the process, learned what it feared most, not witches, but doubt. For in a world so uncertain, certainty, however cruel, was comfort. And as we leave these haunted courts, where justice was weighed on scales of faith and fear, we approach the dawn of something new. The late Middle Ages would begin to question, quietly at first, whether truth might belong to reason, not ritual. The next chapter belongs to those who dared to ask questions the Church itself feared. How can law survive if it fears the light? The dawn of reason did not come all at once. It crept quietly, like sunrise through stained glass, scattering color on the cold stone of centuries. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe was slowly learning to trust not miracles or omens, but proof. And though few realized it at the time, this was the beginning of the modern mind. The universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, became the laboratories of this awakening. Here, monks debated with scholars, scholars argued with lawyers, and parchment became the battlefield where old faith met new reason. At the center of it all stood the law. Law was no longer just divine will, whispered through priests or kings. It was being dissected, analyzed, organized. The Roman legal codes, long buried in dust, were rediscovered and copied. They offered something medieval Europe had almost forgotten, the idea that justice could be systematic. That guilt or innocence might be decided not by ordeal, but by evidence. The rediscovery of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, first compiled in the Byzantine Empire, spread through the continent like wildfire. Students at Bologna pored over its clauses, treating them as scripture for a new faith, the faith of logic. The word evidence began to take shape, rooted in the Latin evidentia, meaning to make clear, to make seen. Slowly, the courts began to ask different questions. Not, did the gods approve? But, can it be proven? Witnesses were summoned. Records were written. Judges began to note inconsistencies, to demand facts rather than confessions drawn by flame. It was imperfect, painfully so. Torture still existed, and superstitions still bled into trials. But amid the horror, a shift was happening. When a merchant accused a rival of theft, the question was no longer which saint he had offended, but what goods, what witnesses, what contracts existed. The law, little by little, was opening its eyes. The canon lawyers of the Church, too, adopted this language of logic. They created entire categories of proof: proof by testimony, proof by document, proof by notoriety. Every word, every signature began to matter. Even God, it seemed, respected a well-written record. In one of the earliest recorded forensic practices, medieval judges began to use seal impressions and wax marks as identifiers, primitive but profound. The signature, the mark of a hand, became sacred evidence. Forgery was treated as a sin as grave as blasphemy. And so the law transformed, not through rebellion, but through refinement. A quiet evolution that replaced divine suspicion with human observation. It wasn't just courts that changed, it was the culture. The same mindset that demanded proof in trials soon demanded proof in medicine, in science, in theology. The world itself became a case to be examined, not feared. Of course, not everyone welcomed this new order. Many clerics saw it as arrogance, man daring to reason where only faith should rule. And there were times they were right. Logic could be cruel in its own way, stripping away mystery, leaving only numbers and procedures where once there had been wonder. But for those who had lived under the tyranny of unseen guilt, under laws that punished dreams and portents, this was liberation. In the great libraries of Europe, manuscripts of law and philosophy began to blur together. Aristotle sat beside Augustine. Cicero shared shelf space with canon decrees. The human mind was, at last, being treated as evidence too. One can almost imagine a medieval judge, hunched over a candle, writing a verdict late at night, no longer invoking saints, but reason. His quill pauses over parchment. He hesitates. For the first time, he must explain his decision. Not to God, but to men. That small shift, from divine justification to human accountability, changed everything. The birth of evidence was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small acts of courage, a clerk who recorded carefully, a witness who spoke honestly, a scholar who doubted tradition. Together, they built a bridge between faith and reason, one cautious footstep at a time. And though witch trials and torture would haunt Europe for centuries more, the idea that truth could be proven, that it must be, had taken root. The age of evidence was dawning. And with it came something even more radical. The birth of the idea that all men should stand equal before the law. That, too, began as a whisper, one that would soon echo through revolutions, declarations, and centuries to come. By the late Middle Ages, reason and record-keeping had crept into law like candlelight into a long dark hall. But that light, for all its promise, still burned in the service of kings. For in the end, every law, however just, needed someone powerful enough to enforce it. And in medieval Europe, that meant the crown. Justice, in theory, was divine. In practice, it was political. The king's court was both a place and an idea, the shimmering center of authority where all disputes, from petty theft to treason, could ultimately lead. It was not a court in the modern sense of robes and gavels, but a theater of hierarchy, where power was visible in every gesture, every title, every jewel. To stand before the king's judges was to feel small before the architecture of order. Velvet, incense, the murmuring of scribes, the clink of chains, all served to remind the accused that justice was not a negotiation but a privilege. At its heart was the royal assize, the traveling court system that brought the king's law to the shires and provinces. These judges rode circuit, bearing the royal seal like a sacred relic. They listened to disputes, inspected lands, and punished crimes in the king's name. Their arrival was both feared and celebrated, for with them came authority, but also opportunity. For a peasant wronged by a lord, the royal court was sometimes the only place where he might be heard. But that hearing came at a cost, deference, travel, and often bribes. Justice, even when fair, was expensive. The idea of the king's peace, a concept born from Anglo-Saxon law and expanded by Norman rulers, meant that all crime was, in some way, an offense against the sovereign. To steal was not only to harm a neighbor, but to disturb the realm's peace, to challenge the order the king embodied. Punishment, therefore, was not merely vengeance, but restoration of the king's dignity, of divine harmony. The punishments were grand and public. Executions in town squares, trials held before cathedrals, processions of shame through the streets. Justice, to medieval monarchs, was spectacle, and the crowd, its witness and warning. In England, under Henry II, the legal system became a machine of unprecedented reach. He introduced procedures that would echo for centuries. The jury of presentment, where local men swore oaths to report crimes. The itinerant justices, who spread a consistent law across the land. And the common law, a living body of precedent that grew with every judgment. Henry's reforms were revolutionary, not because they freed people, but because they organized power. The king's law began to overtake the barons. Local customs, once sacred, were standardized. The patchwork of Europe's justice began, however slowly, to resemble something coherent. And yet, for all its order, royal justice was never neutral. The law was a sword, and the king decided where it swung. Those who challenged the throne found themselves entangled in its sharpest edges. The charge of treason, once a vague accusation of disloyalty, became the most lethal weapon in a monarch's arsenal. It was flexible, useful, and final. A whispered insult could be twisted into conspiracy. A failed harvest into rebellion. Even silence could be treason if the wrong man demanded your words. The trials of nobles were grand affairs, draped in ceremony and dread. But for the common man, royal justice often meant the gallows, the dungeon, or the oubliette, the forgotten place. A hole in the earth where time, like mercy, simply stopped. Still, there were moments when the law looked upward instead of downward. When kings themselves found their crowns weighed against justice. Magna Carta, that fragile, reluctant agreement of 1215, was one such moment. A group of barons, tired of arbitrary rule, forced King John to sign a charter limiting royal power. Among its promises was a line that would echo through the centuries. To no man will we sell, to no man deny, or delay, right or justice. It was not a revolution. It was, in truth, a truce. But it planted a dangerous idea, that even kings must kneel before the law. And though monarchs would spend generations trying to forget it, the parchment remained. Copied, quoted, reinterpreted, it became the quiet heartbeat of constitutional thought. So while justice in the Middle Ages still served the crown, it had begun to shift, ever so slightly, toward the people. For every scribe who recorded a fair trial, every lord who demanded legal process, every rebel who invoked ancient rights, all were chipping away at the notion that justice flowed only downward. And as the courts of kings grew more ornate, the hunger for simpler, purer fairness grew outside their walls. The people, at last, had begun to dream that law could belong to them too. That dream, fragile, flickering, would survive plagues, wars, and centuries of tyranny. It would wait, patient as parchment. And when the world changed again, when new kings rose and reason sharpened into revolution, the dream would finally find its voice. It began, as all great changes do, not in thunder but in murmurs. The 14th and 15th centuries were centuries of contradiction, piety and plague, wealth and starvation, law and lawlessness intertwined like vines around a dying oak. Kings claimed divine right, popes claimed heaven's authority, and beneath them, the people began to wonder, if all claim justice, why does none of it reach us? The law that once brought order now became a mirror for the world's unfairness. The royal courts grew richer, the judges grander, the parchment thicker. But justice itself, that fragile ideal, grew thinner. In taverns and fields, in city alleys and church pews, men and women began to speak words that once would have cost their tongues. Who judges the judge? Who rules the ruler? Rebellion was the natural answer. Across Europe, uprisings broke out, not just of anger, but of argument. People were no longer fighting only against hunger or tax, but against how they were governed. The law, once a symbol of divine order, had become a human tool, and therefore, fair game for human change. In England, the echoes of the peasants' revolt still haunted the countryside. 2 centuries later, those same questions, of rights, of fairness, of the limits of the crown, returned in new form during the Wars of the Roses, and later still, the English Reformation. Each conflict tore away another illusion of divine certainty. When Henry VIII broke from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England, he also shattered the old legal world. For the first time, a monarch's authority came not from the Pope's blessing but from an act of Parliament. Law itself became the source of power. It was a dangerous reversal. Law no longer served the ruler, but created him. Yet the transformation was not purely political. In the courts, scholars of the late Middle Ages began codifying the old customs, translating Latin decrees into the languages of the people. Law, once guarded by clerics and noblemen, began to leak into the public mind. Pamphlets appeared, explaining rights and duties. University lectures debated moral justice alongside theology. A peasant might still die for stealing bread, but somewhere, someone had begun to write that the punishment should fit the crime. The shift was slow, uneven, and often hypocritical, but it was real. For every witch burned, there was a scholar who protested. For every unjust execution, a poet who mourned and questioned. The seed of reform was nourished not only by blood, but by doubt. Even within the clergy, reformers whispered of conscience and compassion. John Wycliffe, in 14th century England, dared to translate the Bible into the vernacular, a simple act with seismic consequences. If ordinary men could read divine law for themselves, what need had they for priests and princes to interpret it? The idea that truth, and by extension justice, could be personal was revolutionary. It laid the groundwork for what would come in the centuries ahead: the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the birth of civil liberty. But in the moment, these early reformers lived and died in danger. To question law was to question power, and power rarely forgives. Still, the question spread. From monastery to marketplace, from scholar's desk to soldier's campfire, the idea grew that law was not a relic of heaven but a contract between men. That justice could evolve. That rulers could be held to account. That punishment was not proof of order, but sometimes the symptom of tyranny. In France, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the small republics of Italy, city-states began experimenting with civic codes, written constitutions that placed limits, however modest, on their rulers. The Italian city of Siena, for example, painted justice itself on the walls of its council chamber. A seated woman, blindfolded, balancing scales, surrounded by citizens rather than kings. It was art, but also prophecy. For the first time, justice was depicted not as divine punishment, but as collective virtue. Rebellion had not destroyed the law. It had purified it. And though Europe would stumble through centuries more of cruelty and control, the tide had turned. No king, however absolute, could ever again fully claim that law was his alone. The people had learned too much. They had suffered, argued, read, revolted, and in doing so, had transformed justice from command into conversation. The Middle Ages were ending, though no one at the time could have said when. The world was shifting towards something new, a world of ink, not swords, of reason, not revelation. And from the ashes of rebellion rose the question that would define the next age. If law is made by men, can men make it better? The dawn of the Renaissance did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in through study halls, parchment, and paint. While popes commissioned cathedrals and patrons funded sculptors, a quieter revolution unfolded in libraries, a return not to new truths, but to old ones. Ancient Rome, long buried beneath feudal dust, was rediscovered in ink. Scrolls of Cicero, Justinian, and Seneca resurfaced, carrying with them forgotten ideas of civic virtue, reason, and the law as an art of balance rather than decree. For medieval Europe, still shaking from centuries of war and pestilence, these words felt like sunlight through stained glass, dazzling and disorienting. Law, which had once been cloaked in divine mystery, began to be studied as a science. Universities across Italy, France, and the Low Countries became laboratories of justice. Professors debated not which punishment pleased God, but which rules best preserved order among men. It was subtle, almost heretical, the slow dethroning of theology by philosophy. The University of Bologna, long a hub for legal scholarship, grew into a beacon of this new intellectual faith. There, students pored over the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great codex of Roman law compiled a millennium earlier under Emperor Justinian. They argued over concepts like equity and natural law, ideas that hinted that justice existed beyond the will of kings or popes. From these debates emerged a new class of thinkers, jurists rather than clerics, men who interpreted law not as divine revelation but as a craft of human reason. Their language changed too. The word, justice, began to appear alongside rights. Rights, not granted by rulers, but inherent to existence. In Florence, the cradle of art and politics alike, Leonardo Bruni and Niccolò Machiavelli examined how law shaped the destiny of republics. Machiavelli, often misread as cynical, was in truth obsessed with civic virtue, how men might live freely under laws they themselves made. The law, in his eyes, was not chains but architecture, a design that, when balanced, allowed liberty to stand upright. Elsewhere, humanist scholars took these ideas further. They began to see history as a cycle, not a divine timeline. Empires rose and fell not by God's wrath, but by their own moral decay, their failure to keep justice alive. Art mirrored this awakening. In paintings of the Renaissance, justice appeared not as a wrathful angel with a sword, but as a serene woman, blindfolded, balanced, contemplative. She weighed not the souls of sinners, but the actions of citizens. The symbolism had shifted. Judgment was no longer divine punishment, but moral reflection. Meanwhile, printing presses multiplied these ideas faster than any priest could silence them. Books once copied by monks now rolled off mechanical presses by the hundreds. For the first time, the common man could own a copy of the very laws that governed him. Knowledge ceased to be a privilege and began to be a weapon. The world of faith had not disappeared, far from it. Church courts still flourished, inquisitors still prowled, and heretics still burned. But beneath that smoke, something new was smoldering: skepticism. Men had begun to ask why, and that single question was the most subversive of all. In this climate, kings faced a dilemma. To govern effectively, they needed law, yet law, once given reason, began to reason against them. So monarchs adapted. They sponsored codifications, centralized courts, and bureaucratic systems that claimed to reflect order and fairness. France under Louis XI and later Francis I became laboratories of royal justice, where the appearance of reason cloaked the machinery of control. It was a delicate balance, rulers embracing rational law to strengthen their power, not realizing that rationality itself would one day turn on them. For among the scholars, jurists, and merchants of the Renaissance, a quiet conviction had taken root. That if men could build cities, write constitutions, and chart the stars, they could also govern themselves. The age of faith was not dead, but it was no longer alone. Reason had entered the courtroom. And from this uneasy marriage of belief and inquiry, Europe would give birth to modern justice, imperfect, evolving, and forever debated. The ink of the Renaissance would dry into the foundations of Enlightenment. And in that next age, law would take on its boldest form yet, not as a tool of kings, but as the language of liberty itself. The Renaissance had taught men to question. But it was the Enlightenment that taught them to answer. The candle that once flickered in monasteries now burned brightly in coffee houses, academies, and drawing rooms, places where scholars and tradesmen sat side by side, speaking not in Latin, but in the language of the people. Justice had descended from its marble throne. It now sat at wooden tables, among printers' ink and common debate. The law, once whispered by priests or shouted by kings, began to be printed in pamphlets and read aloud in taverns. Everywhere, new words hummed through the air: rights, liberty, consent, equality. It was a dangerous vocabulary. In France, the memory of old feudal chains still clinked in the minds of peasants. In England, the echoes of civil war had not faded. And across the Atlantic, colonists were beginning to murmur about laws made an ocean away. Everywhere, people were realizing a subtle, revolutionary truth: the same parchment that gave law to kings could also take it away. Scholars like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau reimagined the very idea of justice. To them, it was no longer divine or hereditary. It was contractual, an agreement between people and their rulers, fragile yet sacred. The power of law, they argued, came not from God's command, but from human consent. The printing press became the pulpit of this new faith. Ideas traveled faster than armies. You could ban a book, but you could not silence the printing block. In dimly lit rooms across Europe, forbidden texts were read aloud, sparking debates that would one day topple thrones. And yet, even as this intellectual revolution unfolded, it remained tethered to the same fragile dream that had guided the old medieval jurists, the dream of fairness. The notion that justice should protect the weak from the strong. That the law should be a mirror, not a weapon. The Enlightenment simply widened that mirror, so that everyone might see themselves reflected in it. In England, this ideal took form in the gradual strengthening of common law, a system built not on the whims of monarchs, but on precedent and logic. Magna Carta, once a dusty medieval charter, became a living symbol of accountability. Even the king is under the law, it declared, a sentence that once sounded like heresy, now accepted as principle. In France, the dream took a different, bloodier path. When reason finally rebelled against the crown, the guillotine became its grim instrument. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen burned through Europe like wildfire, declaring liberty, equality, and fraternity as the natural rights of all men. But revolutions are messy things. For a time, justice wore the face of vengeance. Old laws were torn apart, new ones written in haste. Yet from the chaos, something lasting emerged, the belief that law belonged not to nobles or clergy, but to the people. In this way, the Enlightenment was both an ending and a beginning. It closed the book on the Middle Ages, but its pages were written with medieval ink, centuries of trials, oaths, and experiments in justice that had slowly, painfully taught humanity to reason. By the 18th century, Europe's courts had become unrecognizable to their ancestors. Trial by ordeal had vanished. Juries were rising in influence. Punishments were slowly shedding their public cruelty. The law was learning to speak softly, not out of weakness, but wisdom. And when Cesare Beccaria published On Crimes and Punishments in 1764, he distilled this centuries-long journey into one timeless truth. The severity of punishment should be proportionate to the crime, and its purpose should be to prevent it, not to avenge it. It was the most radical idea of all, that justice was not a performance, but a protection. The world had come a long way from the dark, torchlit village where one wild incident had once shaken a king's peace and forced a re-evaluation of law. From that spark, across the ages, came constitutions, parliaments, and rights declarations. The same logic that once saved a farmer from the noose would one day defend the voice of a writer, the freedom of a thinker, the dignity of a citizen. So when you walk tonight through the quiet streets of your own century, remember, you carry medieval footsteps beneath your laws. Every right you take for granted, every fair trial, every protection, every word of due process, began not in light, but in darkness. It was learned slowly, painfully, through superstition, courage, and human error. The wild incident that changed medieval law forever was not just an event. It was a spark that never went out. It still burns, faintly, steadily, in every courtroom, every document, every whispered prayer for fairness. And as you drift to sleep now, listening in the soft hush of modern safety, know that your peace, the quiet right to rest without fear, is the oldest law of all. The law that began, one night, when justice first learned to listen,